The Hollow Voice. In a forgotten village nestled deep within a forest where no birds sang and the air was always damp, there stood an ancient house known only as the Hollow. The villagers never went near it, for it was said that anyone who entered the house was never the same again, or worse, they never came out at all. Legend spoke of an unholy force within its walls, something old, hungry, and patient. Despite the warnings, two strangers came one autumn night. Emily and Peter, travelers passing through the village, saw the Hollow and, intrigued by its eerie reputation, decided to explore it. They were skeptics, thrill-seekers who believed the stories to be mere folklore meant to scare the locals. The Hollow was nothing more than a rotting structure of wood and stone, leaning unnaturally as though it were on the verge of collapsing into itself. But there was something off about the air around it. It was unnaturally still, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting. "Looks like a good place to film," Peter said, setting up his camera. Emily laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Just another spooky old house." They pushed the door open, and it groaned on its rusted hinges, echoing unnaturally in the silent air. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and rooms filled with decaying furniture and long-forgotten possessions. Everything smelled damp and rotten, like the house had been abandoned for centuries. As they wandered deeper inside, the temperature began to drop sharply. Their breath became visible in the dim light, but the strange thing was that the farther they went, the quieter everything became. Not just quiet in the usual sense, but an unnatural silence, the kind where even the sound of your own heartbeat seems muted. Peter set up his camera in a small, musty room that looked like it had once been a child's nursery. Broken toys and shredded cloth littered the floor. In the corner stood an old wooden crib, its frame cracked and splintered. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "This place is wrong," she whispered. Peter didn't hear her. He was too focused on adjusting the lens of the camera, unaware that someone, was watching them. But not with eyes. The house itself seemed alive, breathing in their presence like it had waited years for fresh prey. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It was a voice, low and distant, as though it were calling from far away, deep within the walls. Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Peter looked up, annoyed. "Stop trying to freak me out." "No, I'm serious. I heard something. A voice." Peter rolled his eyes but paused to listen. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still faint. It wasn't speaking in any language they recognized. It was more like a whisper that curled around the edges of their thoughts, as though trying to slip inside their minds. Peter frowned. "Probably the wind or something." Emily shook her head. "That's no wind." The voice grew louder, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, hollow and distant, like it was speaking through layers of walls. And yet, there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just a voice. It felt like it was seeping into the air, twisting it, bending it. Emily felt a pressure in her ears, like the house was closing in on her. Suddenly, the door to the nursery slammed shut with a deafening crack. Peter jumped, knocking over the camera. The voice, now much closer, whispered from all directions. "Get out." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to the door, pulling on the handle. It wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, as though the house were alive and moving around them. The voice grew louder still, more distorted, no longer a whisper but a guttural croak. "Get out." Peter ran to the window, trying to smash it, but the glass wouldn't break. It felt like it wasn't glass at all, like it was something else, something alive and watching. Then, from the corner of the room, the crib began to rock back and forth on its own. Slowly, creaking with the weight of something unseen, the cradle shifted, and a low, scraping sound filled the air. Emily's eyes widened in horror as she realized that the crib was empty, but the blankets inside were moving as if something were stirring beneath them. Peter backed away from the crib, his face pale. This isn't possible," he stammered. The blankets lifted, revealing nothing underneath. And yet the weight, the presence of something was unmistakable. A cold draft swept through the room, and the voice, now everywhere inside their heads, vibrating through their bones, croaked one final chilling command. "Leave now, or stay forever." Panic overtook them. Peter yanked at the door, and this time it flew open with such force that they stumbled into the hallway. The walls seemed to warp and pulse, closing in on them as they sprinted through the house. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath their feet, as though the house were collapsing around them. But when they reached the front door, it was gone. Instead, there was only a solid wall of decayed wood. The house had sealed itself shut. "No, no, no, no!" Emily screamed, clawing at the walls. Behind them, the voice laughed, no longer hollow and distant, but full, rich, and cruel. The house was no longer just an old, abandoned structure. It was a trap, a living entity that fed on fear, and they had fallen right into its grasp. The walls began to close in on them, pressing tighter and tighter until they could barely breathe. And then, the voice whispered softly in their ears, a voice that now belonged to the house itself. "You are mine now." The floor beneath them gave way, and they plunged into darkness, into the hollow depths where the others before them had gone, never to return. The house stood silent once more, waiting, always waiting for the next curious souls to feed its endless hunger. And in the village, no one dared to speak of the hollow again.